Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a number of supplementary order papers in my name, changes and amendments to the bill that we thank you very much. And I do appreciate my colleagues who have indicated to us already, Labour, New Zealand First, Māori Party, Mana, Brendan Horan, who are all voting in favour of these. So that's yes, and each individual member is voting in favour of, I understand, of at least most of these. I don't think all of them, but at least most of them, which is great news. So I do want to be able to describe them for the House, because I do think that there is still an opportunity for members who are considering supporting the bill to change their view. And that is because it is a conscience vote on these issues, particularly on the supplementary order papers we've put forward, because they concern the issues of gambling. And gambling is traditionally a conscience vote in this House. And we appreciate that the Speaker has agreed that a conscience vote will be held on a number of these provisions, these SOPs. My colleague David Clennon has described a couple already, particularly Clause 6, which is where the provision that authorises the regulatory concessions, and that they've been described, the 230 pokie machines, the 240 automated gaming table terminals, which operate very similarly to pokie machines, and the additional gaming tables, plus the ticket in, ticket out, plus the extension of the licence to Sky City. There are a number of the cashless gaming. There have been a number of concessions. Clause 6 means, as set out, says that the regulatory concessions will apply even where the Gambling Act prohibits them. So there are absolute prohibitions in the Gambling Act that says no more pokie machines at casinos. But because this bill says that Sky City can have another 230, then this legislation will take precedence. But the Clause 6 also says that if there are any decisions of the Gambling Commission or provisions in the Gambling Act that give Sky City a benefit, then Sky City gets the advantage of that. So they get none of the controls. That's what Clause 6 is about. They suffer none of the controls of gambling harm minimisation that are built into the Gambling Act, that have already been passed in this House and accepted by the community as the right way to manage the harms caused by gambling and casino gambling. They don't suffer any of those constraints, but they get all of the advantages. So as my colleague has said, there's absolutely a win-win in this in Clause 6 for Sky City, and we don't believe that that can be at all justified according to any kind of even any kind of deal-making that John Key wants to engage in, but certainly not from a public health point of view. So we have 3 supplementary order papers that deal with that, two that will amend Clause 6, and one that inserts a new provision in Clause 6, 6A, that Sky City cannot retain any of the concessions in the legislation if the contract is terminated. Because at present, it is quite possible for some termination event in the contract to occur. So, for example, they are unable to get their resource consents, or there is a Treaty of Waitangi claim that stops them from being able to proceed. But the regulatory concessions apply, effective immediately, and those concessions will continue to apply, and the Sky City can continue to get the benefit of those concessions even if there is a termination of the contract. And it is not clear in the legislation that is not the case. So we want to make it absolutely clear that if the contract is terminated for any reason, then those concessions, if they are already in place, are gone. There is no justification for Sky City being able to keep its 35-year licence, being able to keep 230 more pokie machines, if the contract itself is terminated. This is just another one of the little examples how in the bill there has been a real failure to make sure that the public interest is protected at every step of the way. And we can help to remedy that if this bill is passed. An additional supplementary order paper we have, sir, concerns Clause 7. And again, this is about the regulatory concessions. And what our amendment will do is delete Clause 7, because Clause 7 provides for the regulatory concessions to have effectively the force of law. So that, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair. The regulatory concessions are part of a deal. They aren't expressly included in the legislation. They should not, therefore, have the force of law. And the reason I think that they do have the force of law in the deal and the way that it's being written is because Sky City and John Key and Stephen Joyce have agreed with this, that they want those concessions to be absolutely locked in. That is why it's unclear about what will happen to those concessions if there is a termination of the contract. So in addition to it being unclear around what should happen if the contract is terminated, there is a further locking in of those concessions and the money that Sky City will make from those concessions. It's not just, they're not getting 230 extra pokie machines and a 35-year licence because they just wanna. They're getting this because it is going to make them hundreds of millions of dollars, at least 40% of which will come from problem gamblers who are harmed as a result of having that money spent. So this is because there is money in this. So the government has allowed Sky City to lock in as tightly as possible the regulatory concessions so that under almost any circumstance, Sky City can keep the benefit of the deal and keep the value of those concessions and continue to make more and more money off the backs of problem gamblers. So my colleague Dave Clinton also talked about another one of the supplementary order papers that we have, and that is the one around the harm minimisation measures, which also goes to the regulatory concessions. There's no doubt, and all of the evidence, despite what the National Party's advisors have written as notes for their MPs, there is no doubt that if you increase the number of pokie machines, if you increase the number of automated gaming table terminals, which is 240 for Sky City, if you increase the number of gaming opportunities, there will be an increase in gambling harm. That is all of the evidence from international evidence, the evidence from New Zealand shows that that is the case. So there has to be, so the whole point of the Gambling Act, of course, was to stop the increase in gambling harm by stopping the increase in gambling opportunities. That is why the prohibitions in the Gambling Act are so strict. So then it becomes critical that if there is going to be this deal, which then gives Sky City this significant financial opportunity by increasing gambling opportunities on their side, that there must be even stricter controls on problem gambling to make sure that the risk of problem gambling is significantly reduced. That is a fair quid pro quo. Under any circumstances, when you're doing a deal like this or any other kind of deal, you would look to balance out the interests. If John Key really believes that Sky City is so desperately poor that they urgently need more machines to help them maintain their business, then part of the responsibility John Key has as Prime Minister is to also address the public interest in reducing the harm that will be caused by that increase. So that is why you have stronger measures as a result of this legislation, not softer ones. The problem is, of course, as we know, that the harm minimisation measures in the agreement are soft measures. So let's take the voluntary pre-commitment that was mentioned earlier. Now, our SOP will require pre-commitment technology in all pokie machines as mandatory, with a strict timeline for when it needs to be introduced. And the reason for that, the best analogy I've heard about pre-commitment technology is that it's like a seatbelt. Not everybody's going to need one. You don't need one necessarily all the time, but there's no point having one in your car if you're not going to use it. And that is why in New Zealand law, we know that the risk of injuring oneself in a car accident is reduced if one wears a seatbelt. So therefore, we have made it mandatory for everyone in New Zealand to do so, and just increase the mandatory provisions for young children, because it helps to reduce significantly the risk. This is what mandatory pre-commitment technology does for problem gamblers. It significantly reduces the risk that any individual person will develop a gambling problem. But it is only voluntary, like this current agreement requires, If it is only voluntary, it will not work, because the people who need it the most... Mr Chair, Mr Chair, Mr Chair, Mr Chair, Mr Chair.
Mr Chairman, what the government has tried to do